flower painting courses, we use different types of paints, and I'm going to explain to you a bit about those. Traditionally, the Watercolour Society was absolutely purist about watercolour paint being watercolour only. And nobody could use white in watercolour paint because white watercolour doesn't exist. In order to paint white, it has to be opaque. Nowadays in the Watercolour Society, if you go to one of their exhibitions at, say, the Bradness Galleries, they use a whole range of water-based paints. So they'll use watercolour, gouache, ink and acrylic. They're all water-based paints. And in our flower painting, we use generally 3 types of paints, and there's a reason for that. So watercolour does what it says on the tin. You add water to it. The more water you add, the more translucent it is, and the less water you add, the thicker it is. And I'll do a little demonstration of that at the end. But a watercolour painting is a bit more delicate. So I've just got a couple of things to show you. I've been inspired by our eco fair and a love of natural flowers. I've done a little watercolour painting of dandelions and buttercups and daisies. So the watercolour painting is quite a delicate painting, but you can get strong elements of colour just simply by using the paint in a more concentrated way. So that's all done in watercolour. This too, just something I did recently. It's all done in watercolour. You can get that lovely soft translucent element, but you can still get some good punchy bits of colour in there. You can get them stronger and harder than that, but that's all done in watercolour. This painting of a rose, this is done in watercolour. And then what we've done, and this is something that we learn on the flower painting course, especially that we're going to really focus on the one in the style of Doofy, because this is slightly in the style of Doofy. I've used a strong ink, or you could use a very strong watercolour, and with a fine brush, we've pulled the shape of the flower out with these little lines. We've done it in quite a loose way, but we've pulled out the shape. Without the lines, it wouldn't exist so much as a rose. It's a really fun way to paint. So in flower painting, we've got 2 basic ways of painting flowers. One is we can create the shape, we can draw it and fill it in, or we can do much more sort of blobby shapes and then pull out the shape afterwards with the lines. Inks are much more vibrant and strong. So I like this make, which is Herbin, H-E-R-B-I-N. They're really powerful, punchy, lovely colours. There's lots of different makes of paints, but I particularly like those. It's worth doing a bit of a tester first because they can be very bright. There are lots of different lovely black and sepia inks and Japanese inks and Chinese inks because they use those a lot. Inks are permanent, so don't use them in your best togs, but put a nice pinny on if you're going to use inks, and they can stain the table and stain all sorts of things. You can use your brushes with them. Make sure you clean them really, really well. Because I think that might eat away at the brush a bit. And while we're on the subject of brushes, one thing I meant to say to you is never, never, never leave a nice sable brush like that in the jar, because it will squish at the bottom and it won't go back. That will be its permanent shape. So you'll ruin your expensive brushes like that. This is something that was done in inks. You can see the colour is much stronger and much more vibrant than the watercolour. You can, because they're all water-based, mix a bit of ink in with your watercolour, so you get a bit of a half-half thing. And the great fun about painting is to play with things, and I'm always playing painting. This is a little something I was messing about with as a bit of a sort of fabric design, and it is a mixture of watercolour and ink. You can see here the dark lines. That is with the ink pulled out. I've also used some ink in the body of the flower to give it that sort of slightly more vibrant look, but I'm contrasting it with the lovely soft translucence of the watercolour. The great fun thing about playing with paint is you might do something like this. You might not necessarily like it, but you might, for example, think, oh, I really like that little bit of it, or that works well, or something like that, or I like where that's overlaid. And you won't make these discoveries if you always paint in a very careful way. When I was at art college, one of my teachers said that they were made to do meticulous drawings, life drawings, all afternoon for 4 hours, and then at the end of the session they had to tear them in half and put them in the bin, just to stop you being precious about what you're doing. This one again is a mixture of watercolour with the soft translucence and then the vibrancy of the ink, and pulling out the shape of the Lisianthus with those little squiggles, of the stronger ink. Gouache is a more opaque paint, and it's used a lot by illustrators because watercolour can look a little bit pale and insipid when it's reproduced. So, for example, if you were doing a children's book illustration, this could be done in acrylics. I think they've used crayon, they've probably collaged, or gouache. And it gives that very much more solid look than if you were to reproduce the pale bit of watercolour. It wouldn't look as good on something like this. The other advantage of gouache is it goes over the top, so you can put a pale colour over the top of a dark colour. And in flower painting, that's really useful, where you might have, say, for example, pink petals, and then on top of that you might have little white dots, and you can do the white dots or the pale yellow dots in gouache and do it on top of the watercolour, and it will show. Whereas you couldn't put a pale watercolour colour on top of a dark watercolour colour. It wouldn't show. It's also very useful in flower painting. One of the reasons people say watercolour as a medium is quite a stressful medium is because if you make a mistake, you've made a bit of a mistake. But actually you can put gouache on the top, so we can cover our mistakes. Now, gouache doesn't have to be really strong and heavy. This is something that I did in gouache. This is all done in gouache. I've used it a bit like watercolour, but because this was the painting that I did for my little flyer, paint flowers, I wanted it to reproduce very well on the paper. So I've actually used watercolour, and I've actually used gouache. So it is a bit stronger, but you can use it in a very pale way, like watercolour. It doesn't have quite that flow that watercolour has. So that's gouache. Good. Now, going back to the student and the artist quality paints, some people, if you're going out and about or on holiday, you might like a nice paint box. If you buy a ready done paint box, then generally speaking, they're all student quality. Cotman, Winsor & Newton, they're Cotman student quality, and a lot of the time they won't be in the colours that you want. So this is something that I created when we go away in our camper van or on holiday. You buy an empty paint box, you buy the little pans or half pans, to go in it, like this. Put them in, and you literally squeeze a blob of your paint in there. That way you've got all the colours that you really like using, and you've got your proper artist quality paints. What this shows is that this is used over years, that watercolour paints reconstitutes even after years. I've just got to add a little bit of water to that, and then it will come up and I can paint with it. Absolutely fine. The same doesn't quite apply to gouache. It might do, but it might not. It might not come up so well. So this is really for watercolour, actual watercolour paints. Gouache tends to just dry out a bit, and acrylic definitely dries out a bit. So, but that's a really nice thing to do. Now with palettes, a lot of people use palettes, but I actually favour dinner plates. Means you haven't always got something to eat your food off, but never mind about that. We're artists, so we don't mind about that. Let's move all this to one side. Sometimes it's good if you've done colour mixing, you know that you don't necessarily want to mix green and red together because you get a sludgy brown and everything. So the advantage of plates is that you can have a greeny coloured plate or an orangey coloured plate or a mauvey coloured plate. And you can see I've been mixing greens here for my painting, and I can pull in different little bits of colour and get wonderful 50, 100 variations of green, and you can see exactly what you're getting. And that's easier with the flat plate than in those tiny little circles, I think. I quite like this slightly messy plate as well, because if you want your colours at points to be slightly sludgier or mixed, you can mix in little bits of this range of all these colours that we've got here. So you can have a plate with clean paints, and then you can add in little bits of this just to muck it up a bit. Anyway, I hope that that's been helpful on watercolour. As I say, Mike is going to do something similar on the subject of oil and acrylic and brushes and what to paint on there.